So, in my last lecture, I briefly discussed Manet's Railway as an example of a work of art that I had a very rich experience with. And I realized that that is an experience that most people don't have access to. Very few people have seen this painting, and even less will have really, spent time with it. And really, what I wanted to use that as an example of was not this particular work of art has anything particularly great about it. Rather, that the experience you're looking for is a real deep connection with specific things. It's good to think about art in general, but it's also important to think about things in concrete, specific examples. And so, one of the examples that I think will be very helpful as an intermediate approaching the subject is to think about modern music. And a lot of times, the experience of going to a museum is thought to be more somehow like it fits more the vibe of something like classical music. And it's true because classical music doesn't rely on language. And as I discussed in the last lecture, part of the project of being an intermediate art enthusiast is to remove language from the experience of going to museums. And so, people can imagine themselves listening to, maybe some Debussy or some, I don't know, perhaps
Chavatsky.
Tchaikovsky. You could listen to Tchaikovsky. I once listened to Shostakovich in a museum, the Fifth Symphony, and it was really quite a great experience. I've also listened to jazz in museums, and that's where you really start to think about what is the difference between something like jazz, and particularly musicians who are well regarded in art history, people like Thelonious Monk or Charlie Parker, any of the major bebop players. What makes that kind of music more intellectual or more um, fitting to go with the experience of going to a museum other than listening to lyrics? Because you could imagine just listening to music on the way there. What kind of mood are you trying to create before you go look at some art? And so I'm here today with my girlfriend to discuss what has become my favorite band, The Strokes, but really Julian Casablancas' music as seen as one kind of artistic body.
Including the voids and his solo pieces as well. So this is all encompassing.
This is all encompassing, and my girlfriend has had to listen to
I've
quite a
had the
bit of,
pleasure.
had the pleasure to listen to Mr. Casablancas' music. And so I'd like to know, what have you thought, not as a Strokes diehard, but as somebody who has just in the car been listening to so much of this music recently?
I remember when I first heard it, I didn't even really know what to think, especially with, I think it was the Yellow album cover. It was so, none of it aligned with a certain time period, which I think is characteristic of a lot of their music because of the sound that they use and also the way that they're singing. Comparing their first, like, 2001 album to the music that they sound now, or they play now, and even hearing interviews of them, their voice has changed with some nuance, of course, but it is much harder to detect as, I would say, a more novice stroke enthusiast.
Right, and one of the things you said was you didn't realize that Is This It came out so long ago.
Mhm.
And in a way they do change, but there's also like this real consistency in their music where the older stuff doesn't sound like it's someone's first album that they made when they were 20 years old. It's like this like full vision of a rock album. So no, I think that's a very interesting point. And what about Julian Casablancas' other music, like some of the stuff like that song "Out of the Blue" I really like, or what do you think of him kind of as an artist? Do you think of him as an artist, or do you think of him as like a rock star that fits in more with other musicians?
I would say because he's really dedicated himself to this over time, and as you said, his sound is very consistent. And to be able to continue to both refine your craft, but also to know what it was at such like an early age and be able to enunciate that, I think is really interesting. And it definitely makes him an artist because of the way that he has portrayed himself throughout the work that he's done.
Hmm. I agree, and I kind of think that I'm not saying that his music is that much better than everyone else's music, but I've really come to think of him as having developed a full artistic persona
Mm-hmm.
in his music. And to me, that's been really interesting because,
In his specific MTV concert, he lights up a cigarette. in the middle of the concert, and the curation of like the vibe, so to speak, from that and from the energy in the room really almost creates this sort of like effervescence in terms of how people are engaging with his music and are considering him as an artist. And while you won't rally that hard in maybe the National Gallery, so hard to spark
Right.
up a cigarette.
And that concert, like, is just like, it's just so beyond cool. It's just like that. It's just like,
And the lighting.
yeah, the
It's
stage
red.
they're on, and just like they all sound so fucking locked in. And so, just over time, I guess I've been listening to the Strokes, and I guess it kind of started at the beginning of the year, like in like, I don't know, maybe February,
Yeah.
because I'd listened to some of their music before, but when I really started, like, and especially when you leave the Strokes and you start listening to like Virtue, I think is a really good album. His solo album is good, but for specific moments on it. Um, but I think I've just kind of developed this whole like idea of how one can approach this music that to me allows it to make sense with the kind of art I go see at museums. And so it's helpful for me to think of Julian Casablancas as basically as good of an artist as someone. I would compare him in terms of artistic like prominence or importance in the history of art to somebody like maybe Cezanne in painting, or somebody who are other painters I would compare him to, because
I would say Jackson Pollock.
yes,
Because
definitely
of the like the way that Julian sings, I feel like is very similar to the way that Jackson applies paint to a canvas. And regardless of the product, they both are artists at their core.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent comparison, because also
you.
the effect of Jackson Pollock, a lot of times it's described as this really chaotic kind of painting, but don't you find them really peaceful to look at?
Yeah, and they all, after you've seen one or two, while they're all very different, he has a very specific style. And once you become almost like acquainted with that style, or you even know what to expect when you look at it from like books and things like that, your local library, you'll know almost the piece that can be drawn from that.
Absolutely. And I guess to maybe take a little bit of a tangent here, we're going to take a little turn onto a dirt road.
Or flipping the record,
We're flipping the record, and
and maybe
we can.
throwing it against the wall.
But I think it would be useful for just like this little lecture to recount another. Let's like think about Julian in a minute. Recount another artistic experience with Jackson Pollock, which is when we went to Glenstone. And so I guess Glenstone to me was the only artistic experience I've had, or experience of going to a museum, where from the first moment I was on their property to the moment I left, it felt like I was in a work of art.
Yes, especially the way that it's landscaped, and even the concrete paths that you're walking on, the way that they've laid them out is so particular and very well intentioned as well.
Yeah.
And we also went when it was freezing, which I just feel like is important to consider.
It was very cold, and it was like half closed. Like the pavilion, which is the whole thing, this like beautiful building, was like half closed. But they had this other show at a building which wasn't as interesting as the pavilion, but in some ways was better to look at art, because the pavilion's so interesting. You just want to look at that, that like pond in the middle and the fronds and those glass windows. It's just such a gorgeous building that whatever's in there is beautiful regardless of what it is. Although a lot of the art that they had there was like kind of that garbage where it's just like shit strewn across the floor. It's like, okay, there's like Ronald Reagan over there. I guess I'm supposed to, this all means something, but it literally looks like someone just left a bunch of shit on the floor.
Yeah, it was so deeply political. I feel like it was almost abstracted from the essence of art and being an artist in that sense. It was almost like you were being a politician.
Yeah, for real.
No hate, but
No hate at all. But when you leave the pavilion, you kind of walk along this path, and there's this nice bridge, and there's this. At first, it's just like this big. You know, it kind of looks like a wall, but you can kind of tell it's this big curved object, and it's like this big metal thing. And we walked over to it, and
it's
it was
a brown metal.
Yeah, like that, like nice rusted, like where they make it out of some kind of shiny metal, but then it rusts in this really beautiful color. And I think it was a Richard Serra, right?
Yeah.
And you just walk into the middle of it, and then when we went into the museum, we had already kind of had this like, when you're in the middle of that sculpture, all you can see is the sky,
And it echoes.
and it echoes, and it was just me and you, and I feel like we came to the same. It was a nice way to come to the same kind of wavelength
Yeah.
before we went in the museum.
It was almost like an appetizer.
Exactly, and we were outside, and so it was this. It was a beautiful, just experience to go in, and so I went in very excited. But I saw a Philip Guston painting, like where we were, like I was waiting for you to use the restroom. And I saw a fucking Philip Guston painting, and it was like this is just like sitting, like in basically like the waiting area, which is kind of interesting. Although it was a terrible painting, but when we went, it was this show that was basically it was like the perfect show. It was honestly it was the best show I've ever seen. It was just how art got from like Marcel Duchamp's Fountain to I don't know. There was some stuff from maybe like the 2000 early 2000s, which were like this like clock conceptual piece, like these two clocks that were just slightly out of time, which was a beautiful piece. And
It was a beautiful chronology.
absolutely beautiful. Just you literally in front of you just walk through modern art developing itself. And there's this one room that's it's actually a relatively small amount that's dedicated to like the New York school. So there's one de Kooning, there's like a Franz Klein painting, and then there's a kind of small Jackson Pollock. And it was pretty small, and I had never really been moved or so interested. I suppose not moved if you're gonna listen to anything I said in my last fucking lecture, but you know, that's what I'm saying. We're intermediates. We're still learning things. I'm not stuck to any way of looking at this.
Why did you use the term moved just then if you disagree with...
I was moved because when I first saw it, my reaction was, this is like shows why Jackson Pollock, like it basically just relies on it being a big painting. Because I saw it and I was like, okay, there's like some school, like it just whatever. But when you kind of start to look at it for a while, it was this black and red and white, or there was kind of a red background. I don't know what number, whatever fucking thing from 1950 something or whatever. And it was kind of his traditional way of creating like an all over painting, but kind of along the middle of it, there was a really thick black paint that almost looked like writing. And it connected it to some later art that was more about kind of thinking about how to use like symbols very similar to how we use writing in painting or whatever. But it created this illusion that there was sort of a message coming through. It was almost there, but not quite being communicated. And I spent probably about 15 minutes looking at it, and I don't know, what did you think of it? Because I think you also moved on to a Lee Krasner painting right after it, which you spent quite a bit more time with.
And this Lee Krasner painting was huge. It was probably, it took up the entire wall for this gallery, and it was like 9 by 13 feet. I moved on from Jackson Pollock because there were these two nice museum guards who were really into discussing what books they read. And so I was really into moving away from that space.
Yeah.
But I rather enjoyed it.
Well,
but I was surprised that it was much smaller.
yes, and I think that's a great observation because that's an excellent example of a kind of at surface level arbitrary thing that ends up being super important. Because if someone's standing in front of a painting or having some annoying conversation, it becomes very difficult to appreciate the art. So I think that that's exactly what I find interesting is, especially because I've worked at museums, I've heard so many people talk about so much dumb shit when they're in museums that I've become very used to tuning out annoying conversations, because there's also sort of a way in which you can think about it as like, you are doing this experience with respect and you're being quiet and you're thinking about other people, and these people are acting as if, you know, they're in their fucking living room. And there's a sort of dichotomy there that creates, it forces you to remove yourself from the situation. And with a lot of abstract art, that is kind of what you're trying to do. You're not trying to concentrate on what's really happening. You're almost kind of trying to space out and let your mind kind of just be whatever it is.
Which is where some of that peacefulness comes from, especially in a Pollock and Krasner.
And that Krasner, in a way, it was interesting how it kind of towered over spatially the Pollock. It was behind the wall. It was in its own room that was like dedicated to it, and I thought it was a very interesting painting. What did you like about that particular canvas?
If you closed your eyes and normally wore glasses and you squinted them, so it was already pretty blurry, and then you had less to perceive with.
Do you mean like all the way close or like squint?
I would say squint. Like you could see the light, you could still see what's in front of you, and you can make out the shapes, but it's not as clear. And then you were watching two large brown birds get into a fight with each other. But I liked the movement that came from that, and the colors felt very natural, which I feel like you don't really see as much in a Pollock because a lot of them are these much cooler tones. So I thought that contrast was cool, and I didn't know that it was a Krasner who's married to Pollock.
Yes, and she also sort of spurred a lot of his artistic creation. I mean, I don't know that much about their relationship, but in some ways she seemed to have like a balancing effect on him that allowed him to actually create things. And I think your description of the birds was very apt. There was something about like owls looking at you, and it was almost a kind of figurative abstract painting. It was much more figurative, if you're going to say that, than the Pollock was.
Yes, but you really have to be squinting. It really is just to give a picture of what that Krasner really stood out to me as. But obviously, when you're standing in front of it, you're not thinking about two birds kind of in this scrimmage.
The fact that it was sort of bled of color, did that attract it to you, or did that seem initially kind of problematic?
It honestly attracted it to me because as we went through this chronology of art, it was some of the first that I feel like really bled, where prior a lot of the colors were like separate, and that did attract me to it, especially because it was so large and it encompassed my entire field of vision.
Absolutely. Well, anyways, that was just an example of like how, you know, you might see a painting and sometimes that kind of experience is seen as like, oh, that's somehow more like deep or true than, for example, just being on a bus and the sun is setting and the sky is just absolutely gorgeous, and you decide, you know what, I'm going to listen to Is This It for the 42nd time this week. And what's interesting is like that music is a very social thing nowadays, and a lot of it's about going out and seeing music. But I really love, I would, if I had to pick between listening to music by myself and going out and like seeing live bands or whatever, or even like talking to people about music, I'd pick just for myself. Like ultimately it's just there to be something to listen to.
Yeah.
And so I guess that might kind of beg the question. It's like, okay, well, you can like the Strokes, like I don't care. I like this band. Why are you fucking talking about it? And that's where it kind of comes back to my point that because Julian Casablancas over this widespread, you know, music, was able to craft an identity for himself. It relates itself to abstract and modern art because modern art is all about creating an interesting identity. And people like that I talked about in the last lecture, for example, Wallace Stevens has this perceived identity of being like a ghostly, icy creature, right? Like he comes across as this very strange kind of thinking person. And that's ultimately what's really interesting, is thinking about how you can make sense of the fact that someone thought in that way and how you can make sense of your relation to that kind of existence.
And also manifested their existence in something that we can later engage with.
Absolutely. And in the case of Julian Casablancas' music, he has such an understanding of how to make beautiful songs that this is all in the context of how just, like my favorite Stroke songs particularly, just like really fucking slap. But what's interesting is how we can pull that back and the same effect is still achieved, a kind of unifying sense of like oneself as a triumphant individual. I've often thought about, and this is something I haven't talked to you a lot about, that his music really fits in this kind of lineage of thought that really begins as far back as like Prometheus, the man bound to a rock. And what becomes like admirable about his character isn't that he's relatable, but rather that he stands apart from everyone else and just how much he hates the oppression of life. Like not anything that really concerns our day-to-day existence, but just this kind of cosmological hatred for the fact that people suffer, whatever. And this was later figurated, probably the next really important step in that lineage is Satan in Paradise Lost, because Satan is the angel that fought against God and said that, and that's why Satan's such a strange character. And after that, Prometheus is clearly on the side of man, whereas Satan becomes this kind of middle ground. And then later, you have Ahab, and Ahab absolutely fucking hates man. But
Moby Dick?
In Moby Dick, obviously, but he hates man. But what does he hate more than man?
Whales.
Fucking that one goddamn whale in particular. And so it becomes more and more this kind of strange being of what becomes admirable about them isn't that they're a good person or that you want to be like them, but you just respect their defiance of everything that is basically limits them. They want their individual existence to be essentially the same thing as the entire universe. And that's such an ambitious thing that it becomes kind of imaginatively interesting, because you get these really beautiful visions and amazing figuration of things that are relatable. And so when I first kind of started talking to you about his music, I kind of talked about like he represents this really kind of interesting relationship where the partners are coming at each other as equals.
Mm-hmm.
And I've since kind of changed into thinking that he's really more focusing inward on himself. And what is kind of sad but is interesting about the music is how detached he is from whatever relationship he's in, at least in the early music. But in the New Abnormal too, and especially in Ode to the Mets. But that kind of relates him to people like T.S. Eliot, or like I said, Wallace Stevens, or I mean, I swear I read other poets than that, but they are really kind of the two of the most important. But even Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is a lot of times seen as like, oh, like she describes how I feel or whatever, but like what's interesting about her poetry is like, I don't think it like that at all. She seemed to like basically always be on LSD or something. Not in the sense that she doesn't make sense, but just her, like the pitch or the frequency, like, some variable of the way she perceived things seemed to be turned all the way up.
Like the way that she describes that slant of light in one of her shorter poems is so illustrative of her being in her room, and you can infer a lot from it. But at the end of the day, she was just describing this smaller scene, which I think in some ways poetry can be connected to songwriting. Which, does Julian write his own songs?
Well, yes, Julian, I mean, I don't really know, and ultimately I don't care. I do think of him as like, basically, like all the music is his vision. And I think there is a weird thing that like all the other dudes in the band were just playing riffs that he wrote, and it almost is like kind of probably an extension of the control that he's trying to come to terms with, because a lot of his music is about relinquishing control of the other person. But the way that he kind of justifies that in his head is just by staring at the TV, or by kind of looking out into the middle distance. He doesn't really replace that with anything. He's just kind of, he forms his identity around that detachment. And all of that kind of makes the experience of listening to the music something that keeps giving new insights. And so you can listen to, also because the albums are so consistent and in themselves are these real like visions of an artistic creation, or I suppose it's necessary to be specific. So what I'm really talking about here are the first three albums, and the New Abnormal, Virtue, which is a Void's album, and his solo album. And then I would say outside of that, there's a lot of collabs he's done, like the Daft Punk collab, and a bunch of other just kind of weird here and there stuff, like weird covers the Strokes have done and stuff.
And being on Brat.
Yeah, I don't think his Brat collaboration was necessarily one of his better things.
I feel like it symbolized him as an iconic artist.
Yes. But his place, the thing is, the Strokes are so popular, but they hold a really weird place in pop culture. And he doesn't seem like he was ever interested in being like a major player in the pop culture scene. Especially,
I feel like this is evidenced in his early interview with Nardwuar, before Is This It even came out. And I don't remember exactly what question prompted Julian to respond in this way, but Nardwuar leaned the microphone over to Julian, and he grabbed Nardwuar with both of his hands, fully encapsulating both the microphone and Nardwuar, and looked him dead in the eyes and was like, just wait for it to come out, which I think is really interesting, because there was this like hype in America because it had only been released internationally, but they were touring in America at this point. And for him to have created an artistic identity in American culture with this much hype before even having the full vision or the full semblance of something that can be engaged with.
Right, for real. There's like this. There's just something about them where it's like that moment where he grabs the microphone, and I know this sounds weird, but like my heart skipped a beat just thinking about it. Like
there was so much emotion.
And he seems like such a, like, it's just in that moment, because he's like, there's more to life than being fucking popular.
Yes.
And for a rock star to say that, it's like, okay, obviously, but you also get up on a stage and have everyone stare at you singing.
Yeah.
So it's like, kind of seems like you want to be popular a little bit, but because he's like, just wait for the fucking music to come out, the music justifies all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big part of being an artist rather than just appreciating art, is if you really want to kind of push the boundaries of who you are as a person and what you think is the way to interact with existence and just what your being is, there's gonna be contradictions in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be strange parts of yourself that are revealed. And I think the perfect example of why the Strokes' music is so relatable, or both relatable and unrelatable at the same time, is the collab that they did with Regina Jones, which is called like Modern Men, Old-Fashioned Girls, or Old-Fashioned Men and Modern Girls, whatever. But this fucking song,
the title, yeah.
Those words are in the title in some combination, but this fucking song, I probably listened to the song like 1,000 times. And it's the one part in any of the music that I can think of, at least at this moment, where the female voice comes in.
Yeah.
And what the female voice is saying is being said at exactly the same time, and it's when they were still using that like phone effect. Mm-hmm. So basically the song is like listening to a phone call of these two people that think the exact same thing, but they're both just fucking mad at each other. And the song comes to a climax when Julian Casablancas in this just kind of like bored voice is saying, "You're always thinking about yourself." And she's saying, like, at her most like fever pitch, beautiful voice, "You don't love me." And because they're different people, they're looking at the exact same thing and seeing basically just opposite sides of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so while the rest of the music is about his one side of it, I like that just in this one song, you get that other side. And the way that it's done is just, I think, really good. What is that? I wouldn't say that's my favorite Stroke song, but I would wonder, what is your favorite just Julian Casablancas song?
So the one that I would say that I have a lyric that I'm most familiar with is on Julian's solo album, when he's like, he has his leather jacket on and he's pissing on someone's casket.
Or no, "I'm going to hell in a leather jacket."
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the rest?
"At least I'll be in another world while you're pissing on my casket."
And that one I think is really ingrained in my head for numerous reasons, probably because it was one of the first songs that I really
and I would
realized was the Strokes.
Don't you think that was one of the first ones I would like repeat over and over?
That's why I know it so dearly. But I would say that the Adults Are Talking are really good, which is kind of a basic take. But Hawaii is also really interesting as well, because he's taking you, and in a lot of the other ones, they don't mention specific places, but he names all of the islands.
Or you assume it's New York, right?
Well, they have the New York City Bad Cops, but that one is less idyllic in this version of Hawaii in terms of him just wanting to be there and being able to kind of picture this and himself there even when he isn't physically there. I think is a nice sentiment.
Yes, I agree, but I do think I once saw, this just happened the other day, that comment I saw on Reddit that was like, "This is the only idyllic song." That shit pissed me off. I mean, you remember that shit pissed me off? And like, what pissed me off about it was like...
Well, they were saying it has zero melancholy.
Yes.
Which I would say that both being melancholy and being idyllic can be together, but you could be in a mind space where you could still be upset, but you could be thinking about something nice. Or almost this like...
Well, what I would say is that...
aspiration.
The limit, the kind of like reason that Julian Casablancas isn't ultimately one of the greatest artists ever is because he is only able to achieve an effect of melancholy. And to me, it's never idyllic because there's always this issue. There's always something wrong. And so even in Hawaii, he's like, though a nuclear disaster might be on its way,
Yeah.
like it's never just, oh, we're having fun. It's like, because everything sucks, we can have fun, or we can have fun but I'm bored, or you're having fun but I'm not, or I'm having fun but you're not, or like, it's always something with fucking Julian.
It doesn't bring the same peacefulness as looking at a Pollock through that chaos.
Yeah. You don't think it brings the same peacefulness? Yeah, I would agree, because when you're done with the Pollock too, like the Pollock is associated with this whole experience of going to a museum, which I feel is much more idyllic than like, generally being on a bus and listening to fucking music.
Yeah, but in lecture 1 that you gave, you say that for some museums with great collections may be inaccessible, and you can look at a book. What if I said that you could go to a library and put on noise-canceling headphones, and you'd be engaging with a piece of art in the same environment?
Yeah. Well, it works for some. I kind of talked about that a little bit too. Like, it works for some art, but not in other art. But I guess really the point is more that I think that his music is kind of limited by an inability to move on from something. And so whereas I really like the New Abnormal, I don't think it's one of their best albums, partially because the whole middle of it sucks. But even if you're just to take like the first 2 songs and the last 4 songs, mush them together and say that's the album, it is still concerned with this kind of melancholic mood. And I think even though that is like a defining factor of the music, it doesn't have to be. I could see the music being good. And one song that does not make me feel melancholy, I would say this is the one song, which is the song you just quoted, which is weird because it talks about like going to hell and shit. But that song to me is basically like the achievement of modern man. If you can feel the way that song makes you feel all the time, you would, like, the world would be a good place. Because what that song's about is basically, I mean, it begins with this line, somewhere along the way. And so the point is, you're not coming to life at the beginning of it, and this isn't your final decision, but you're on the road. And you're looking back at where you've been. You said somewhere along the way something's gone wrong. And he has this sequence where it's like, this leads to this, leads to this. And the final thing, the especially the final 4 in the second verse are, somewhere along the way, exacting vengeance gave excitement. Somewhere along the way, that excitement led to pleasure. Somewhere along the way, that pleasure turned to madness. Sooner or later, that kind of madness turns into pain.
Ooh.
And the whole point of that is that everything has led him to something that's gone wrong. And I'm not making any conjectures about his personal life, but really, the really, really great music kind of ends there. Like, that's really his last great song. And I love a ton of the music that came after that, but I kind of sometimes wonder if he'll ever, like, either the Voids or the Strokes will, or him with another band or himself, will put out like his best album ever, or whether that's behind him,
When was the last time he released an album?
Well, I think the last music, the Voids released an album like a couple months ago, but it was not very interesting in my opinion, or I need to listen to it more. But yeah. Well, anyways, that was just a little conversation that we wanted to have about Julian and our thoughts about some art, and it was just so nice doing this in conversation.
Yes, and I actually have one more.
You have as many more points as you want.
That we haven't explicitly talked about, but we've talked about this topic before, is the curation at the MoMA of High and Low. I think it was in the early 2000s. And I'm interested to know more about where your take is with this, with music, with Julian's music being so popular in these cases. Like, he has like, I don't even know how to pronounce that number. It has so many commas in it. But it's like an insane amount of views. And he isn't as synonymously known. Like, sometimes you hear the Jack Black, the Strokes. It's not the Picasso.
Yeah, for real.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, so I love Kirk Varnedoe, and Kirk Varnedoe curated that MoMA exhibit, and I think the failure of that exhibit was basically to not include someone like the Strokes. And I might have been in the late 90s, so I don't know if the Strokes were making music yet, but it was what that exhibit basically ended up saying was that there's this art and it was influenced by this stuff, but there's still these clear differences between them. And one of the songs I have on my playlist is this song Boombox, which he did with The Lonely Island. And I showed it to my friends, and we got in this fucking like hour. We talked for like multi-hour fucking discussion about whether or not it was like music. And my point is like that's obviously fucking music. It goes on a playlist. You listen to it. It's music. Bam. But I think it's a really good question because it's something I'm kind of just starting to really think about is what other bands could I put in this kind of way of thinking? And there's really not that many. There are specific albums. So for example, I would say like Loveless is another thing I would think of as this is equally as important a work of art as a Manet or a Picasso in a museum. And if it was just one thing, yeah, it would be, you know, in a museum, it would be, but you can listen to it on your phone. So I don't think of that as like the thing in High and Low is it kind of pits them against each other.
Yeah.
Whereas the way I'm trying to think about it now is more like all I'm trying to do is like art. So if this is a way for me to like art more, I want to pursue it. And what it's done for me is allowed this Julian Casablancas' music to be something I can keep coming back to. And I don't have to be like, what am I going to listen to today? Or what am I going to do? And in my mind, these thoughts have unraveled themselves to be really interesting things that have affected me as a person. And I feel as though, for example, like I would never want to meet him because whoever he is as a person to me is no longer like it can't be realistic. Like
But he might grab both of your hands and look you deep in your soul and tell you to have patience.
I would be like
you would want that experience
Emma,
like Nardwuar did?
No, it'd be like when Emma Chamberlain got flustered at the Met Gala.
With Jack Harlow? So you would be Emma in this situation, and Julian Casablancas would then end the conversation as Jack Harlow saying that he loved you.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be sweet.
But that's my point is like I'm not coming at it from a point of view like I just love all his music and everything he makes. It's like from listening to it, I've just really had a new perspective on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've had a new perspective on is that looking inwards to yourself and seeing emptiness can in itself be a valuable experience. And one of my favorite songs is on First Impressions of Earth, which I think is one of their best albums. In some ways, I think it's their best album. It's definitely the most melancholic. It's definitely the darkest. And I just think it's also some of the best songwriting. It's not maybe the best vocal performance, and there's maybe a couple boring songs, but I really think it's one of their best albums. I'm even just going to say it's the best.
Say it.
Like On the Other Side is such a good song. Heart in a Cage is such a good song. And Heart in a Cage, in some ways, that's probably their best song. Anyways, there's this one song that's like right after, it's kind of right in the middle of the album, and it's come off to this like kind of huge roaring start. And then it's just this weird fucking keyboard. And one of the things I was saying to you the other day is like, could you imagine a weird little keyboard going dun 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 bum bum, being on Is This It? And so just in that 5 years, it's already, the music's in a whole different place. And all he's saying is, I got nothing to say. And that in itself is such a profound statement. And that's kind of the statement of Is This It? Is this it? Like, basically, I'm bored. I got nothing to say. But for whatever reason, that album has just become this, like, amazing thing in so many people's lives. And represents such an important aspect of, I think, thinking of yourself as important and thinking of yourself as complicated and worth, like that boredom is in itself worth attention.
Earlier you mentioned that you had some sort of internal tension with using the word that art is moving, and you've elaborated this in lecture 1 as well. Do you feel, or I guess in what ways would you describe that shift in people and that resonance that Is This It has had on people if it isn't moving?
Well, I would say that music, this is actually something that I wanted to kind of recontextualize from what I said in that first lecture, is I don't mean art isn't moving. I mean abstract painting doesn't need to be emotionally moving.
Mm.
So in that, I was really thinking about Twombly. I was thinking about Barnett Newman. I was thinking about, you know, people like Sol Lewitt, who isn't painting but is kind of painting adjacent, or, you know, all sorts of weird modern art. Painting or music, and particularly like rock music, is super emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is a lot of music, when really considered and thought about, is very emotionally confused and, in my opinion, upsetting. I think a lot of music, when you really think about what's going on, is like, damn, that fucking sucks. And I don't. The thing is,
Especially in rock songs.
especially in rock songs. And all I mean by that, I'm not saying, I'm not judging any kind of music. All I'm saying is, like, if you're going to keep listening to it and really think about what kind of artistic persona the music generates, you want to do it with music that has really thought through what kind of person the artist is, wants to express themselves as. And I think that what's crazy about is already at 22 or however he had fully developed this idea of who he was. And I think there's just something so cool about who he was. Like, they were so popular, but he didn't give a fuck about it. And they were all kind of like, you know, cute, I guess is the idea, right? And but the other thing is,
there's a quote about their high cheekbones.
yeah, exactly. But that's the thing
they
is,
hated that.
Nardwuar like asked him like, oh, do you need you know, a strong jawline to be in a rock band? And their guitar player, what's his name, Nick, I think. He was like, I don't fucking know, man. Just listen to music. And
He's like, you have to be good at it.
it was the one Nardwuar interview I've seen where, like, I didn't like Nardwuar. He seemed like an asshole. And they just seemed so much more real than him. They seemed so much more authentic, like, cool people.
They definitely had a mismatch in energy levels. It was like if Nardwuar was on like level high and you're like looking at your grandpa and you're like, please turn the TV down. And the energy that Julian and the guitar player was giving was, you have to turn it up. Not saying that they had to turn it up, but just to describe the levels of energy in that 4-part interview.
No, for sure. Well, anyway, I would just say maybe one last thing we can think about is maybe like one lyric in particular or something. Or what do you think?
I think that the emptiness that you brought up from Julian and the is this it and this kind of boredom is in some ways could be compared to the emptiness of a Clifford Still painting, and the ways that achieving emptiness in music is much harder than achieving emptiness on a canvas that comes blank.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's such a good point. And maybe that can tie it all back to what we were saying at the beginning is like, maybe you don't listen to the fucking Strokes when you're, you know, at the fucking MoMA or whatever. But maybe don't think about them as such disconnected experiences. Like, maybe you're on the way to the Clifford Still Museum and you got to drive to Denver. Maybe you throw on Is This It? And rather than being like, oh, this is just fun music, just listen to it, look out the window, have a little conversation if you need to, but really let the lyrics kind of be part of your day.
Absolutely. And in the case of going to the art museum, this is it. It's very pleasant.
Absolutely. And I would say, I think sometimes I've thought about, there are certain poets, for example, T.S. Eliot, where arguably the first poem he ever published, like the first poem in his first collected poetry, is the best thing he ever made. And there's some bands where it's like that first album or something is just like, there is something special about it. And especially even that first song, and it just starts with, can't you see I'm trying? And I think that's just like, that's kind of the message that makes it, rather than just being good art, something that is worth engaging with. Because if you really think about your life as something that you're really trying to make sense of, and you're really trying your best, it doesn't matter if you're bored. It doesn't matter if you're sad. Like, you just gotta try. And I think that kind of chill fucking like, just like, do your best kind of message is what makes Julian Casablancas music something I just love listening to. It's like a little just nice. I mean, I listen to it all fucking day. I listen to it in the morning, when I'm at work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When's your favorite time to listen to a good? For example, if I were to put on, let's see what. I mean, I play this playlist a lot, but let's say I wanted to put on Instant Crush, which is the "We'll Never Be Alone Again."
Ooh.
Where like a car, outside, like where are you listening to that?
Okay, so
In the club?
I give two scenarios here. One is the car between the hours of like 5 and 7 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
and it's summertime and it's
Mhm.
warm,
Mm-hmm.
but it also could be winter and it's freezing cold and pitch black.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going somewhere in the winter, you have to be going somewhere exciting. But if you're listening to it in the summer, you could be driving anywhere and Instant Crush would be appropriate. My second situation is you are walking out of some sort of establishment, like a bar or like a club or something, and you're like, okay, that was really cool. Like, I had a great night. And then you hear that song, and then you end on just a banger, and you're feeling almost euphoric. Because regardless of the melancholy that he may be describing in that song, you're feeling some sort of like idyllic environment that's curated through the other aspects of it.
Don't you think a lot of his music kind of sounds like maybe like the last scene in a movie where like someone walks out, for example, of a bar, like you were saying?
Yeah, like, is this it?
That's the music that plays, right? It's like Instant
Totally.
Crush. It's like you feel like you're the main character.
Absolutely. And so I guess we can gather from this that we're just living in Julian's world.
Or rather that Julian's just somewhere up living in our world, you know what I mean? If
Yeah.
the music's good enough, it just becomes a part of how you see everything.
Absolutely.
And, like I said, there are other, maybe not other bands, but definitely other albums that I feel are part of this. Like I said, Loveless, definitely a lot of jazz albums like Mingus or certain Thelonious Monk albums.
There's one Boa album that has like a blue and red cover. It's particularly nice. Or the Cockatoo Twins as well.
Yes, yeah. And especially that song Heaven or Las Vegas. Like, I wouldn't say that album is necessarily like perfect, but that song, and they're cool because they kind of almost start to sound like not even music in some of their music. It's like it's more like art.
Yeah.
It's like sound art or whatever. So it was a lovely conversation, and I hope you enjoyed lecture
Lovely
2.
lecture.
Lovely lecture, I guess, here. And yeah, I guess we'll kick it to Julian for the outro.